Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast from myself, Thomas Flight, and my fellow video essayist, Tom van der Linden from the channel Like Stories of Old, where we seek to explore the depth of what cinema has to offer. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider supporting us in one of two ways. You can go to our Patreon, the link is in the description, or you can go to patreon.com/cinema of meaning, or you can go to nebula.tv/cinema of meaning, or follow the link in the description, where you can sign up for Nebula and listen to all of our episodes an entire week early, as well as get access to our bonus exclusive episodes on Nebula. This week, we're talking about Rian Johnson's follow-up to the original Knives Out, the sequel Glass Onion. Tom, this was one, I think we both watched it over the holidays, but you said, let's talk about it. What made you interested in discussing Glass Onion on the podcast?
Well, I really enjoyed the first one. I actually rewatched that one as well. I watched Glass Onion twice now. Once, the first time the day it came out. And I just really had a good time with it. I think it's a very fun murder mystery, just like the first, even though I think thematically it does a few things differently. And there's a few things I have a few mixed feelings, which is probably the main reason I want to talk about it, because the thing I love about this podcast is that I usually go in with certain things I not feel certain about, and then we somehow find some insights into it along the way.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, usually not until the end, but...
Right. That's why you have to listen to the end of the podcast.
Sometimes it just takes time to kind of go through all the nitty-gritty of it. And but anyways, yeah, I watched them back to back. I do think the first one has my preference because it just oozes that kind of Clue board game vibes, which I really enjoy. Yeah. It has like the classic Victorian era house, all the classical elements that you expect in a murder mystery like that. And but also that one also I think had an interesting twist that we'll probably get back to at some point in the discussion on this one. But for me, what Glass Onion was about for me, or what kind of what got my interest about it, is that it's almost like a non-mystery presenting itself as a mystery, and then because there's the whole metaphor with the glass onion, something that seems layered and complex, but in reality it's completely inside the whole time, completely you can pierce right through it. Transparent, that's the word I'm looking for. And I think my main question is that there's some like little issues that I have with the movie, especially towards the ending. But like my main interest was regarding the construction of a story that deconstructs nothingness, basically. That
right. Yeah.
It's a deconstruction of not just of the genre, but also certain expectations that we have as the audience.
Yeah.
And there's some elements of that which Johnson also did in The Last Jedi, which I'm also feeling like a little bit iffy about. Like if you deconstruct something like a theme or an expectation, and then how do you balance out between, it's supposed to be stupid, or is that still, or does that still count? Does that count as a meaningful commentary? Can you make something meaningful out of like the nothing, or does it just leave you with
nothing? Yes, yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but that's kind of like some friction I experienced.
Yes.
With the thematic nature of this movie, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know if our audience will get it, but I know exactly what you're talking about, because I think I felt the same thing. And that's probably the biggest thing I'm interested to talk about, is that friction. Also, just he brings up a lot of interesting commentary and themes here that I have mixed feelings about. So it'll be fun to get into that, kind of what he's trying to say. Mm-hmm. I agree that I like the first in this series more. I think, like, for me, one of the things that I felt iffy about with The Glass Onion was this movie for me doesn't quite work as well as like a genre mystery film. It works pretty well as a social commentary comedy, but it didn't give me the feeling that I want to get out of a mystery genre, which maybe we'll get into. Was that intentional, etc.? I don't know. We'll find out. But I felt like the first one actually did that better. But I like the whole premise of what Rian Johnson is trying to do with these movies. I think it was the Hollywood Reporter writer roundtable or directors roundtable, maybe. He was talking on there about how everybody does these kind of Agatha Christie mystery, mystery films as period pieces. And because that's kind of where we place the genre in our mind, because that's when, it was at sort of its height with the Agatha Christie novels and stuff like that. But, the interesting thing about this, and I'm just restating what Rian Johnson says in that roundtable, you can go listen to it. But the interesting thing about that is those books at the time were contemporary. They were like commenting on culture, and they weren't period pieces. And so to really fulfill that genre in the way that someone like Agatha Christie was, you kind of have to make this contemporary thing that has these characters that come from our own society and is commenting on society. So anyway, he was just articulating that that's kind of his vision for these movies and part of it. And I think that's a really fun premise that people should be exploring. And so I just like the idea that he's making these movies that are unabashedly contemporary. He's not trying to make this timeless classic that's going to live up forever. It's just like, oh yeah, what are people thinking about right now? It's COVID, it's vaccines, it's, billionaires, all these things, renewable energy. And I'm just going to put all that stuff in a movie. And I think there's something very fun about that on the surface. How successful that ends up being, we can get into. But yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to sort of discuss here.
I think some of that contemporariness might actually age better over time. Yeah, it's hard to say, but sometimes you watch an old movie and there'll be like this obscure reference to something that was relevant back then, but that's since gone completely obsolete and kind of forgotten. But I can imagine there might be, like, especially with regards to COVID, like that. I think people right now are kind of like, or for me at least, I don't want to see it in movies. I'm kind of tired of it. But I can imagine, like, not to compare this to something like the Second World War, but like after that, like directly after that, people didn't want to see these deep dive, like, reflections of the wartime. People just wanted to move on. And I feel like we're in a similar state now where people kind of want to just move on from COVID. But I can imagine, like, maybe 10 years down the road, people look back and they're like, oh yeah, that's kind of what it was back then. And maybe even like 20 or 30 years later, when there's a new generation that hasn't experienced it, hopefully, it might actually be this little relic that captures something about what it meant to be alive in COVID times, to say it very dramatically. But
right. Yeah, I think this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it also relates to kind of a concept which I think is true most of the time, which is that if you want to actually make something more universal, a lot of times the best way to do that is to make something very specific. That applies to characters a lot of time, character stories, where if you try to tell this story about a character that just applies to everyone's life and you try to make it too universal, it can just feel flat and empty. But if you really delve into what specifically makes that character them and makes them tick, you can find the stuff that is more universal to all people, often in this like hyper specificity. And I think that applies to kind of setting and time as well. It can break down, but I think if you more directly comment on what's going on now, you can find things within that that are more universal than if you're just trying to vaguely make something that kind of feels timeless, and it can end up being more flat. Anyway, that's a tangent about storytelling in general, I think, but it's at play here.
But I do have to say, like, about the COVID stuff, it's mostly present in the early part of the movie, like the setup before they go to the island. We'll do a quick rundown of the story later, but just to finish off this quick COVID thing, I do like that Johnson did use it actually to reveal character, and also it both reveals something about the characters in this specific story, but it also reveals, it has a meta layer of the types of responses that people had towards COVID. Like you see, there's one, the science guy, he has the most advanced mask, so to say. Like he's the most effective one, and he's the one who's concerned about keeping his distance. Like he's the one who's following the rules. And then there's the Twitter woman, the model, Kate Hudson's character. She just has this like almost like a veil that's with holes in it. It's like purely performative. And the politician has one that keeps falling down, and it just keeps slipping off, and it's only there when it's like a half committed, but not really, mostly performative. And then there's Miles Braun, Edward Norton's character. He comes with this really weird mouth spray that supposedly does something. It's not specified. Probably it does nothing, but it's kind of the techie response, like, oh, let's innovate our way out of this through something that looks shiny but probably isn't that effective, which captures a lot about the nature of his character, as we'll get into later. But
I should say it's not Miles Braun at that point. It's the Ethan Hawke cameo working for Miles Braun, which which I found disappointing, because when Ethan Hawke showed up, I was like, oh, cool, a cool, fun Ethan Hawke character, and then he never shows up again.
Yeah.
So that was a very teasing cameo, but yeah, you're totally right in that he's not just. There's maybe like a few kind of cheap jokes in there where it's like, ooh, haha, COVID stuff, you know, but he is being slightly more nuanced than just kind of pointing a finger at like, ooh, masks happened, you know. He's, like you're saying, he's actually using that to develop the characters and do, you know, set up some interesting groundwork about who they are as people and how they interact with the world and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Oh, and the last one was the Dave Bautista's character. He's the kind of manosphere dude who doesn't wear a mask at all.
He's somewhere between like a Joe Rogan and a Andrew Tate. Miles Braun is kind of this vague Elon Musk character, and different characters have sort of real world analogs. Not all of them have like an exact one, and they're not exact, but it's a fun game to play to kind of be like, who was in Rian Johnson's mind when he was writing this character?
I think it's especially funny because the Miles Braun character became more Elon Musky in hindsight, probably because of the Twitter takeover, which I'm pretty sure this was filmed in 2020 or something.
It wouldn't have happened.
But he obviously became much more prominent in like the public sphere since then. And
this is jumping way ahead, but there's a painting of, I didn't notice it the first time, but there's a painting of Kanye in one of the rooms, like holding a golden grail, and he's like depicted as a saint in the background. And I was like, was that a prescient? Also, like, Kanye's been controversial for a long time, so I can imagine, but that's another element that just like took on even more meaning since whenever this was filmed. But also maybe they doctored Kanye in the background with VFX or something that's not outside the realm of feasibility.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe we should do a very quick recap of maybe the first Knives Out also, just to see what kind of series is established here and what Johnson's vision was for whatever this is going to be in the future. Initially, we had Knives Out, which was, as we talked about, this kind of Clue board game type-ish murder mystery where you have this very eccentric detective played by Daniel Craig, Benoit Blanc, who comes in with this really funny accent, and it's pretty much his series. Like, he's the only character to carry over into this next mystery. And but in the first movie, he basically comes into this scene, this patriarchal head of the family apparently committed suicide, but it seems like a little bit iffy. So there's Benoit Blanc to investigate, and then it turns out there's a few twists and turns, and it kind of focuses on the other central character, the nurse of the old man. But what it comes down to, it was basically, it started out as this murder mystery, but then pretty quickly on there, at least to me, like there was this twist where it was revealed that we already had the kind of revelation that you expect at the end already happened like 30 minutes in, where it's revealed that this nurse switched up the medicines by accident. Like he was supposed to get like a small doses of medicine, and then there was another similar flask that carried morphine, which he wasn't supposed to have that much. He was supposed to have like a full flask of the one medicine and then a little bit of morphine to take the edge off, and she switched them around, and he, wanting to protect her, kind of stages his own suicide. And so the rest of the story then is no longer really, or at least it seems to be no longer really about the murder mystery, but rather about can she get away with this? Is the detective Benoit Blanc gonna find out that she was involved, and so it becomes this very different cat and mouse game that I really enjoyed. And then somehow at the end, there's like this Shyamalan move where he pulls off another twist where we actually get some new information about what actually happened, which wasn't as clear as it was initially assumed. It was like he used the analog, the Benoit Blanc talked about the donut and the hole in the middle, and then you think you have the hole was filled, but then the filling turned out to be another smaller donut which had its own hole in the middle.
Yeah.
And at the end, it turned out to be spoiler alert, but Chris Evans, who was like the more typical bad guy, and I like that the movie was basically this deconstruction of all these kind of these political, cultural figures. Like there's the Nazi child and the lefty, progressive, social justice warrior who's also kind of not always who's a bit of a hypocrite at sometimes. There's all of them kind of are hypocrites. With the self-made woman who started with the $1 million loan, and it's basically a deconstruction of all these characters. And then the movie, to me, it ends very nicely with this affirmation of basically the nurse type character and the kind of kindness and honesty that she stands for. And I really love that it's also her actions as being a genuinely good person is actually what leads the movie to its kind of happy ending, I'd say.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not sure that captures it pretty much, I think.
I think that sums up enough, at least how it relates to this film, which kind of like is doing something similar but a little bit different in terms of its approach.
Yeah, I wanted to recap this because I think that indeed with the second movie, or this new mystery where we only have Benoit Blanc who goes into this new mystery, but then I felt like there was some elements that weren't as clearly communicated as they were in the first movie. It also maybe it was lacking a little bit of that heart that, what's the actress name who played the nurse?
Ana de Armas.
Ana de Armas? Yeah. She brought a lot of heart and kind of groundedness into that movie that I felt was slightly absent here. But I like that this movie did have a similar twist, but it's structured differently. It's not...
Yeah.
Especially on rewatch, and now we're moving into spoiler territory for Glass Onion. Maybe do the setup first. We basically have Miles Braun, who is this super rich billionaire visionary person, and he invites his close circle inner circle of friends who call themselves the Disruptors to this private island for a fun weekend getaway and to play this murder mystery game that he set up. And at first it seems like Benoit Blanc is also invited, if not only as like a power move, like, oh, we have the great detective at my little game because I have money and can do whatever I want.
Yeah.
And so all these friends, they all, like in the first Knives Out, they also kind of, as we talked about, reflect these different political and cultural archetypes, I guess, or the things that are currently happening. That's kind of the setup. Like they all receive this box, this puzzle box, that's the invitation. And it seems like he's this real genius who is able to construct all these intricate mysteries, and that's what brings them to the island. Benoit Blanc is also going there, and then it turns out he wasn't invited, and he comes to sense that there might be a real threat against his life or against the life of Miles Braun. And that's the initial setup. Yeah.
My favorite moment out of the opening is just the visual of all these different people slaving over cracking these intricate codes or whatever, which Benoit Blanc later calls simple child's puzzles. Although, spoiler, we eventually find out he didn't actually do any of them, so he couldn't have known if they were or not. But they probably were, based on how easily he busts through any of the other puzzles later on.
And also because of Duke's mother, who keeps calling out like,
it's
a stereogram or something like that. There's a lot of little hints that all of the complexity that you see is actually not that complex at all if you really dive into it, but that becomes more relevant later.
Janelle Monáe as Andy at this point in the film is just like, instead of, she like looks at the box and is like, no, I'm not dealing with this, and just takes a hammer to it and smashes it open, which is a nice little piece of kind of foreshadowing, and just kind of sets up sort of, I think, the thesis of the whole film to some degree, or like sets up this initial image that is then later reflected towards the end. But yeah, we get all these people onto Miles Braun's giant glass onion island. He's going to throw this dinner party mystery thing for the weekend. Who knows? Somebody might actually want to kill him.
And Blanc ruins it like within seconds. That's one of my favorite moments from the early part of the movie.
He solves the mystery before the game really even starts, and wins himself an iPad. But then I think like this is where I kind of struggle. Maybe I'll throw out my kind of critique, or what I struggle with this movie, before we actually get into sort of what it's doing thematically and whether or not that works. But like, I think for me, like, I thought a lot watching it both times, or after the first viewing and then watching it the second time. I was thinking a lot about why exactly it didn't quite work for me in the same way that the first one did, because it left me unsatisfied on some level. But I ultimately think not in the way that was intended, because I think there's an element of that where Rian Johnson is constantly kind of setting up these things like, oh, it's this crazy mystery. And then what he's doing is essentially trying to say like, no, it's actually not that mysterious and complex. It's actually just, Benoit Blanc says at the end, which we'll get to, it's just dumb. And so that's a maneuver that he's trying to do in the movie. And I think he does that well at certain points where you're like, ooh, what's the mystery going to be? And then you're kind of like disappointed by the fact that, no, it's not actually this crazy thing. It's just this dumb, simple thing that someone who's looking a little bit deeper can just get, figure out pretty easily. So I kind of like that premise, but one of the effects that maybe this has, or I don't know how you would have done it differently, but I think what's missing for me is it feels like it takes so long to get to any sort of actual mystery at the heart of this movie. And so instead of actually establishing a real mystery early on and then showing that mystery is in fact empty and false and dumb, like, it just feels like I'm constantly waiting to get to the real mystery, and it doesn't really come until like an hour and 10 minutes into the movie, which is where there's, this bigger twist. But there's no body. There's not even like an essential element of, I think, the mystery genre in a way is like, there's a body and then we're trying to figure out who killed this person. There's not even a body until Duke Cody dies, like almost an hour into the movie. That death you can pretty immediately feels like a red herring. You're like, it's not the real. So anyway, all this to say, I think, he's trying to set up the mystery of like, who is going to try to kill Miles Braun. But I don't know, for whatever reason, I think that created some sense of like, it just felt like constantly stuck in setup.
I had it on the first viewing where I was watching it with my fiance, and we were both like, oh, we're like an hour into this movie and there's not been a murder yet or anything.
Yeah.
But the second time I did notice, there's a few details that already hint at the structure. Like in the initial puzzle, they solve the four puzzles, and then they turn it north or something. And then there's a new layer that reveals like a whole new set of mysteries. And that's kind of what happens in the movie structurally, where the twist that you mentioned it happens almost at the exact midpoint of the movie. And I know that because I paused it to go to the bathroom. I looked at the Netflix timeline, and it says I'd seen an hour and 10 minutes, and I had exactly an hour and 10 minutes to go. So it's literally like the center point of the movie, or the midpoint, that shakes things up and kind of flips the board around again, or the game around, and then pretty much starts from the beginning again with a new perspective. Because, for those, if you've seen it, at the midpoint, it's revealed that Benoit Blanc actually got the box from Janelle's twin sister. I'm forgetting what her name was. Maybe Helen or something?
Yeah, it doesn't say on IMDb because Janelle is just credited as Andy. But yeah, Andy has a twin sister. We didn't say this, but hopefully people have seen the movie if they're watching this. Like, Andy is sort of the co-founder with Miles Braun of his company, but then she was ousted. We don't really know why at first, or there was some kind of separation between them. So she's not really...
She was a social network, as they say.
She was not supposed to be there, but she just kind of shows up. And at first we're not sure what's going on, what the tension is, why things are so tense. You might even have this seed of like, oh, maybe she's the one who wants to kill Miles. But then at a certain point, it's revealed that Andy Brand is actually dead. Somebody killed her. That's kind of the real mystery. Her twin sister, Helen, has learned that she died and is coming to Benoit Blanc this invitation. And so they are both coming to the island. They've both come to the island as on this kind of covert mission to figure out who really killed Andy. And yeah, like you said, that comes pretty much at the heart of, it's the pull up the center part, and then all these other puzzles unravel.
Yeah. I do like it in hindsight because it does feel like it makes, those kinds of twists are hard to do. Like there's movies that have where the point of view character or like the main character has some kind of twist at the end that completely changes the motivations, at least in the perception of the audience, and they're kind of hard to pull off. I think the Tourist with Johnny Depp tried to do that a little bit, which wasn't a great success as far as I can remember. But this is not exactly the same. It doesn't happen until at the very end, but rather at the midpoint, and it does feel very in character. He does explain at the beginning specifically, like Benoit Blanc explains, like he's not looking for a vacation, he's not looking for a game, he wants a real challenge, he wants a real case. And so initially it might seem odd that he would go on a vacation to play a game with this billionaire. And so with the twist, it actually kind of makes it feel like his actions were more in character than they initially appeared, where he was actually going on this literal case. He actually had a mystery to solve. And what I also liked about him, I really love him as a character, by the way, and the way he's played by
he's great.
Daniel Craig. He
seems
to have so much fun with it, and you can just see it on the screen. But the one thing that I think distinguishes him from other detective type characters is that he also has a very strong sense of righteousness, and he's very empathetic, and he's not just like a detached observer of society like so many others. He's actually engaged, and that's why he's really affirmative of the nurse character in the first movie, and here he's also really involved with not just fixing the puzzle, but he also wants justice. Like he's really out to do some good instead of just playing around with his own intelligence, so to say. To me, that's also what feels really in character here, that he's not just there to play a game, he's actually there to help this woman who has no other recourse. And so I liked that twist a lot because it felt like that's more the Benoit Blanc thing to do, and also it makes the whole first half of the movie feel more deliberate on their part. Like they're not just kind of these passive members of this party, and with Benoit Blanc kind of being the fish out of water who's invited but then not really, and so he kind of wanders around to make himself at home and kind of participate a little bit, but he's actually a more active protagonist. And you see little details on, if you're watching it again, knowing that there's like, you can see like the cutoff points and the little glances, and there's little hints there where you can see on a second viewing that he's actually being more perceptive and more on a mission than you would assume on a first viewing. So that's one part I liked. Yeah,
it did work better for me on the second viewing, I think, because I knew what was coming, and because here's kind of this, I mean, maybe we can just get down to it, like kind of part of the central tension. When you set up a mystery in this way that is essentially a glass onion, it's hard to not, you want people to feel like, oh, I kind of saw it coming, or like it is kind of obvious in a way. Like that's the point he's trying to make. But you also don't want to just make the movie be obvious and what you or you have to still entertain people, or make a movie that isn't just dumb. The movie itself has to be intriguing or interesting on some level. I think for whatever reason, it didn't quite connect with me in that way. I had fun watching it, but I didn't entirely connect with it. But on the second time around, I think there's enough details there, enough that's interesting in how it's structured and how those details are present. I think it's just one movie that for some reason early on, I don't think it quite clues you in enough to what you're actually trying to look for, that I felt like I could engage with it, but maybe I just missed something, or who knows. Anyway, it's subjective.
Yeah.
All that to say, I think there's some very interesting stuff there, even if it didn't quite resonate with me or engage me in the mystery the first time around.
Yeah, I think the issue is that you're basically looking for anti-meaning, and that's the meaning. In the sense, like in the first movie, you had all these little details and they all led to something. Like every little tangent eventually connected back to some little piece in like the bigger puzzle. But here it's kind of the opposite. Here you have an absence of a puzzle, but you do have like all these little pieces, and they kind of lead to nowhere. And so, but you're still making a puzzle, but as you're making it, you realize there's no picture at the end. So like maybe one piece will be of an entirely different puzzle, or another piece will just be an apple or whatever, like completely unrelated to even making a puzzle. But and then if the if the point is that there is no picture at the end, like in a way, like following the pieces that don't go to that picture does affirm that, but at the same time you're still left with no completed puzzle in your, like that it's not satisfying in the same way that a completed puzzle would be. Like for example, you have the Derek character, I think it was, like initially when they get to the island, Miles Braun is like, oh, it's just us friends here, like no one to disturb us. And then there's this stoner dude that walks into frame, and then Miles is like, oh, that's whatever, he's not part of he's not part of the experience. And so you're, as an audience member, then you looking for puzzles in a murder mystery movie, you're thinking like, oh, how is this gonna fit into, what piece of the puzzle is this towards the end? And then at the end it turns out he's just there, he doesn't really do anything, there's no resolution to his presence on the island. And so you can argue, oh, you know that's the point, he's literally not part of the experience. This Miles says it explicitly, this isn't some layered complex message. Again, it's a glass onion, like what you see is what you get, it's just dumb. He's on the island doing his own thing, it's not related. That's like the whole point of it. Is that a satisfying image to have at the end?
I'll say this and then I'll kind of close the book on like my critique or criticism here, because I want to get into sort of, I think, what the commentary is, because I think that's probably the most interesting part of this discussion. But I think ultimately, like, I'm fine with the end note being unsatisfying. It felt almost to me like there wasn't enough setup for, it didn't feel like there was something there that was then falling apart to me. It felt like it never quite completely got established, or it was deconstructed as things were established. I don't know, but I don't know how I would fix it either. I can't really say like what would have made this better. So there was some disconnect there, and I'm not sure what.
Yeah, I didn't mind this as much, because I do think, as you wanted to get into it, it does relate to some commentary more than Johnson's work in the past, maybe. Like I'm thinking of The Last Jedi. I don't want to get into that movie too much, but I think it's the most interesting movie of that new trilogy, but also one that I disliked because it felt like it was just deconstructing things for the sake of it. And especially, like, I would have felt different about it if we didn't have a very nostalgia-driven movie just beforehand. Like if this was the beginning of a new trilogy that would use this, like, oh, here's this Snoke bad guy leader, and then Johnson comes in and he's like, nope, he doesn't mean anything.
You're right, yeah.
And like that, at that point, I wonder, like, if you're gonna tell a story like that, just include it at all. Like, why even? It always feels kind of a little bit condescending at times when people are like, oh, we're gonna introduce this trope, and then we're gonna subvert it, and that's it. Instead of just not use the trope and subvert it by doing something interesting or original instead. That would usually have my preference. But bringing this back to Glass Onion, I do think there was a specific type of commentary that this whole deconstruction was aimed at, and that does feel somewhat culturally relevant. Like there's some parts where I felt like, especially at the end, or at the very end, the part with specifically the part with the Mona Lisa, where I was like, what is this, like, really a message, or is this just whatever? Like,
right, yeah, deconstruction for the sake of it, yeah.
But I think overall, like for me, I think the most interesting commentary has to do with the kind of the people we admire as glass onions in a society. In that sense, like there's a lot of, we talked about Elon Musk, but there's a lot of figures like him, I think,
Yeah.
in various different cultural or political areas that you could also apply the kind of glass onion metaphor to. And I think in that sense,
Right.
deconstructing that and revealing the emptiness inside does come with, or does carry a significance or a meaning that you then kind of inversely, that does carry meaning in the real world, even though it's telling you it has no meaning at all. But you know what I mean?
In the film.
Yeah.
No, I'm realizing now, kind of as you're saying that maybe that is sort of where this fell a little bit flat for me, because there's not what the central thing that this movie is subverting. It wasn't really subverting for me. And maybe this coming in the wake of like Elon's Twitter situation actually hurt it in a sense, because there's kind of this, the central deconstruction is, oh, Miles isn't actually this brilliant guy. We've kind of, Blanc even says it at one point. He's talking with Helen and they're saying, oh, it could be Miles. It could be Miles. And Blanc is like, it wouldn't make sense. It doesn't make any sense that he would do it. So it's not impossible, but they kind of assume that it's somebody else because they're like, Miles is smarter than that, is the assumption. And then we're deconstructing that assumption throughout the movie. I'm thinking that maybe because the parallels were being drawn between Miles and Elon Musk already before I even watched this, and the cultural moment is sort of this revelation of, Elon Musk is maybe not as smart as all these people thought he was, because he's publicly playing out this disaster of trying to take over this company. I don't know if that seed planted in my mind when Miles shows up on screen. I'm not thinking, wow, here's a brilliant guy. And then finding out later in the movie, he's actually dumb. I'm kind of thinking, oh, this is sort of a Joker character to begin with, that I'm not supposed to take that seriously. So I don't know if that like left it a little empty for me, where what the movie is trying to subvert the most, I was already kind of thinking along those lines.
He's already presented as kind of a caricature and not as this genuine mastermind or genius. Yeah, which does, I get what you're saying. I didn't really feel that way myself that much. I think also mainly because this whole franchise is so filled with these heightened caricatures that I didn't really like. I didn't really feel like I was supposed to buy into his genius initially. And there's also like a lot of these little hints where in the flashback scenes, in one of them, you'll see him have like the outfit that Steve Jobs had. And there's another one where a little bit more obscure, but where he, in the initial flashback in the bar, where he looks exactly like Tom Cruise in Magnolia, who in that movie plays this misogynistic
just
alpha male pickup artist / course seller. And so there's a lot of hints that he's not this genuine genius. He's just this kind of imposter figure almost, but
which fits with the glass onion nature of the movie, where in a sense I kind of like the fact that it's setting him up in that. This is where I'm extremely conflicted. Sorry if my commentary about this movie is all over the place for people listening to this, because I have very genuinely conflicted feelings about this movie. Because on one hand, what I just described leaves me feeling unsatisfied. And on the other hand, I can think about that and kind of go, that makes a lot of sense within what the movie is trying to say, because from the beginning, he seems kind of suspect and dumb, or not as brilliant as maybe you're supposed to think he is. And then by the end, that's revealed and you're like, okay, I saw that the whole time. And that's that's the nature of the onion being glass. Maybe it actually works. Maybe it doesn't. I want to discuss like this. So we talked about kind of this, we've already mentioned this revelation. Miles is already dumb, or is just dumb. He says words wrong. He didn't actually start the company. Andy did. He didn't write the mystery. He didn't make the mystery box. There's all these things that reveal. He's more just like opportunistic exploitation of the resources around him than anything else. But all these people in his central circle, they vie for him, or they lie for him in court. They do all these things because he has this leverage over them. And they've also bought into sort of this artifice, this sense that he is this brilliant mastermind on some level. So that's one of the central critiques of the film, is just critiquing those kinds of characters, the ones we hold up simply because they're successful. And then we go, oh, because they're successful, they must be brilliant. And then we interpret everything they do as brilliant because we're presupposing it's brilliant because they've been successful. So there's kind of a systemic critique there of, I think, success and meritocracy, and sort of saying our culture isn't as much a meritocracy as we often think it is, or at least, capitalistic Western culture is not as much a meritocracy as we might imagine sometimes. And some of these things that we think this person's playing some kind of brilliant 5D chess, it's much simpler and dumber than that. Yeah. So I think that's the core at the center of this glass onion. If you have thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them. But I'd also be interested in talking about maybe anything else that you see this movie kind of commenting on, or what some of the other commentary is.
Yeah, I think in addition to what you just said, one small detail that I really like, you mentioned the 4D chess game. There's I got this from the IMDb trivia. I didn't figure this out on my own, but in the initial puzzle that they have to solve to open the box for the invitation, there's a chess setup that they have to solve. And apparently that setup is called a fool's mate, which is according to IMDb, the fastest possible ending to a match. And it's so named because it's practically impossible to win this way unless the losing player is ignorant or inattentive enough to set themselves up for it. So that's also kind of, I like that was also a metaphor for the way Benoit Blanc kind of walks into this game or into this mystery, expecting much more intricacies and complexities, and ends up being played by the fool's mate.
Yeah.
But yeah, regarding what you said about specifically also Miles's relation to his disruptor crew.
Yeah.
There's also to me, what that also really showed is that he's not just this, he's a glass onion. Like, he's this obvious guy, almost like a con artist or imposter, but he's also, you can also see that he does have, or through his friends, that he does have a bad effect, or a degrading effect on society as a whole, because you can see all of them, the whole crew that they have is basically held together by them depending on his money, depending on his grace, essentially.
Yeah, yeah.
And so you get this societal setup where a lot of these different elements, like from politics to cultural figures to science people, are dancing to the tune of this kind of person, which I do not think is a very desirable position for a society to be in, because I did feel some sympathy for some of the characters, at least, that were in this disruptor group, like the politician who does, she's not doesn't seem like the most genuine do-gooder that, it's no Leslie Knope from Parks and Rec or something, but you can clearly see that she is very negatively affected by having to do whatever Miles wants her to do. That's the whole thing with the clear. We haven't named it yet, but basically Miles wants this. The reason for the initial conflict that he had with Janelle is that he basically found out about this very unstable form of energy that he wanted to bring to market, obviously in his enthusiasm, more uncritically and faster than everyone else would argue for, and that's why she left. But the other characters, they kind of stuck with him, and now the politician feels stuck because she has to promote his source of energy or else there'll be trouble. The science guy is also depending on his money and research funds or whatever, or else he'll be in trouble. And the influencer, Birdie, she's just she's the kind of person who would be canceled and never heard from again were it not for someone like Miles kind of bailing her out culturally speaking. The same with Duke's character. He's kind of given a platform because of him, and otherwise he would just have to get a normal job or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I like that through this whole dynamic, you can see the way billionaires or like these type of specific type of figures are not just like benignly dumb or jokers to be laughed at, but they also have a societal impact that's not to be underestimated and ignored.
Yeah.
And I like that the movie does, it's not as explicit as a true like societal commentary, but it does display those dynamics a little bit in a way that I did think was interesting. It adds a little bit to it. It's not just, oh, billionaires are dumb, ha ha ha.
Right.
Let's have a laugh at them. It also shows like why it's important to reveal the glass onions for what they are, because they do have an impact on the rest of us, and they do.
Yeah.
They are in powerful positions that can affect us all, and we should be more mindful of that. I guess that's what is being said there.
Well, and it's kind of pointing, the most explicit part of it is pointing towards the sort of converse to what all those people are doing, which is, talked about the imagery at the beginning. They're all playing his little games. And then you have Brandy, or Helen actually, who is just going to smash it up because those games aren't working for her. So, she's willing to smash the glass, bust everything apart to get to whatever's at the core, because, why would she play these games? They aren't working for her. So I think it's not just saying, hey, all these people are benefiting, have this parasitic relationship to Miles Braun and are benefiting from them, but also reinforcing his status. There's kind of this nod towards the only way to sort of escape this trap is to stop playing the game, like stop engaging with his games. You don't need to play them. So I think that's interesting. And I like that I really appreciate that it has this more comprehensive critique of sort of the system surrounding billionaires and sort of critiquing that, because I think without that, the message is kind of empty and hollow and is sort of the haha, billionaires are dumb kind of thing, which I think can be unproductive, because there's a sense in which I think if it didn't have that, you could almost read this movie as like, oh, Miles Braun is a problem because he's an idiot. If he was actually this smart, then everything about him would be fine. It's like, it's because he's an idiot that we don't have to respect him. And I think that's a little bit of a trap sometimes, where in order to like critique, the ultra wealthy or something, we have to paint them as idiots or horrible, malicious people, when sometimes they are, but it's not just that makes them a problem. It's the whole structure of power that allows them to sort of have achieved that status in the first place. At least that's my read. And so I feel like, just pointing fingers at them and sort of being like, oh, haha, these people are idiots is a little bit of, it's not, you can do that. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's a little bit shallow ultimately, sort of as like a societal critique, I think.
But what did you think of the actual ending? Because at the end, Helen, she figures out, or she finds the little napkin that has the original idea for their company that would, we haven't talked about it directly, but there's this thing that would prove in court that Miles Braun didn't own the intellectual property that was the intellectual foundation of their business that she set up with her twin sister, but it was actually her idea and that he stole it. But Miles then burns it. It's a little like a contrived little moment, but it's, I think all murder movies or mystery movies have some degree of that. I'm willing to forgive that. But then like from there, like the climax reaches this kind of impasse where Benoit Blanc also says like, okay, I've solved everything I can do. Like this is where my jurisdiction ends.
We don't have enough proof essentially to like get the police involved or really do anything. Yeah. So he's just kind of like, over to you, Helen. Here's the whiskey. Do whatever you want.
And that's for me where the movie probably, that's the part that I have the most conflicted feelings about. Like I'm not sure, because what happens is Helen starts pushing over these glass statues, and then she uses a little bit of the fuel, the unstable fuel that's by the way running the entire mansion on the private island, and she pretty much blows the whole place up. And then there's the Mona Lisa behind protected glass, but Miles had this little override button. She presses it, and then the Mona Lisa also goes up in flames, thereby fulfilling the prophecy that Miles had of wanting to forever be named in the same breath as the Mona Lisa. But it fulfills it not in the way that he probably envisioned it. But to me, I feel like there's a very knee-jerk reaction to that moment where you feel like, I think that's the reason why a lot of more conservative reviewers like Ben Shapiro did this horrible take on this movie. But
yeah, I'm not surprised.
Feel kind of upset by this movie, because there is a reading, I think, here where it feels very much like the lefty progressive answer to like, like screw traditions and all the classical art. I want to have my gotcha moment.
Just blow it up.
Yeah, I want to. Let's burn it all so that I can feel self-righteous about what I did, or at least about bringing like this billionaire down like a peg. I'm not sure. I don't think that's the intended reading of that moment. Like there is that earlier analogy of the disruptive philosophy where Miles explains somewhat incorrectly, apparently, as Benoit Blanc later reveals, but at least in his perception, or in Miles's perception, the disruptive philosophy is that you begin with breaking like a few small things that people wanted to have broken anyways. And that's how you kind of reach your infraction point.
Right.
Whatever that means, or like that's your gateway into becoming a true disruptor. And that's, you can see that reflected at the end. She's pushing down the statues. Everyone else is like cheering her on, and they kind of join in. Like the other characters, they also want to express their anger a little bit. But then what he also said earlier is that then you break something that nobody wants broken. And that's when you receive like hostility. That's when people don't like you anymore. Because that's what reveals that people, they want to rebel a little bit. They want to revolt, but they don't truly want to break the system. And so I feel like that sort of comes back at the end, where you have that initial moment where you're like cheering with Helen, like, oh yeah, let's break those empty...
Sure, let's smash the Banksies. Yeah.
Let's break that down. But then when it comes to the Mona Lisa, I think a lot of people were like, oh no, not that one though.
Yeah. I'd be interested to discuss what you think the actual meaning of that is. But I think on a very basic level, it at least works as sort of a fun, like Rian Johnson is kind of playing with the audience at that point he's intentionally setting something up that most people I think are going to cringe a little bit and be like, oh no, don't burn the Mona Lisa, because that's kind of the feeling he's playing with of like, okay, we like the rebellion. We might even get on board or cheer on the quote unquote true disruption of the system. But then you get to, we all have our part of the system or the establishment or whatever that is kind of precious to us, and where we go, do we really have to go after that thing though? And I think that's an interesting discussion. But at the very least, I like that he's kind of poking and prodding the audience a little bit to make us, you kind of are left with having to think about, okay, where are my boundary lines? Like, what kind of disruption am I comfortable with? But I don't know, you definitely could sort of walk away with the feeling of like, Rian Johnson thinks we should just burn it all down. That's the best move. Yeah. Because that's kind of literally what Helen does.
Yeah, I think you were right with that first part where I think the main goal was to have people reflect on the moment they would stop cheering when someone revolts against the system. There's a more like in-universe explanation for why it was important to destroy it, because it's kind of suggested that this fuel is going to be powering all the people's homes at some point, and it will be like the Hindenburg, but in every house of everyone. And so you can argue that, we need like to put a hard stop to this transition. And so we need something important and dramatic. And so you can see the burning of the Mona Lisa as like cutting off an arm to save the rest of the body. But that, to me, that didn't feel as impactful to me, because I didn't feel like the threat of the world actually going to blow up if nothing else happens it didn't seem that credible.
Right, yeah.
But that might be because I'm in Europe and billionaires don't have that kind of pull here. Like he'd have to apply to like a lot of commissions and safety nets. And there's like layers of safeguards before something like that could actually happen. And so I don't feel in in that sense, the burning of the Mona Lisa was like an absolute necessity. It's like this has to happen now, or else the world is doomed. Like, it didn't feel to me like that kind of scenario, even though
Yeah.
I have seen some people make that argument.
It's also, it's a mystery comedy movie where everything's heightened and supposed to be exciting. So I think there's a little bit of danger of trying to draw too direct of a metaphor. But he's definitely, he's definitely trying to comment on he's definitely making a commentary, I think, with how the end is structured. So
because you can also read it as, for example, when people talk about the cutting down of the rainforests or like environmental issues, and they're like, oh no, I don't want that to happen. I want that to stop. But then like some organization will be like, oh, maybe stop eating meat. And then people will be like, oh, no, not that way. Though.
Yeah, that's my Mona Lisa.
That's my Mona Lisa.
Bacon is my Mona Lisa. Yeah. It's extremely valid territory to explore that kind of boundary of where, what are we precious with and why are we precious about it? And that's something that Rian Johnson has explored in the past, even like The Last Jedi. I think he was playing with some of that. But yeah, it makes people uncomfortable, and it's kind of interesting territory to play in. I'm curious what you think of sort of the more explicit commentary he makes, less metaphorically with the plot, but there's those lines where Miles burns the napkin. I think the way it's supposed to be is nobody else actually saw the napkin besides Miles and Helen before he burns it. But she's kind of asking everybody to vouch for the existence of the napkin. Like, you lied in court, you know the truth, so would you be willing to sort of back me in this situation and expose Miles as a fraud? And she says the line, you would lie for a lie, but you wouldn't lie for the truth. So she's kind of setting up this thing of, oh, you were willing to go into court and lie because it fulfilled your selfish ends of accomplishing this specific, you got kickback from Miles for it. And then as soon as she's like, hey, will you back me up on the fact that the napkin was real? They're all kind of like, but we didn't really see it. That would be a lie to say that we actually saw it. And then she's kind of calling out that hypocrisy, which is something I think you see people do. I won't name any names, but you see people do from time to time where they have a standard where they're like, I'll play this game and bend the rules a little bit where it suits me. And then as soon as somebody's like, well, you could bend the rules for this, also for this reason, they're like, actually, I care a lot about the rules because I'm a very principled person. Yeah. That is an interesting sort of call out. And then it flips after the glass onion blows up and they're all walking down onto the steps. Then the different people in Miles's group are kind of like, oh, I saw him driving to, they say these things that they didn't actually see then.
They switch him the glass with Duke's character. Which actually, it happens. The first time you see that moment, it does show the thing that actually happens. You can spot it. Like Miles actually putting the glass in his hand on the first viewing, on the moment it happens for the first time, which I thought was really funny. But yeah, go ahead.
Anyway, I was just curious if you had any thoughts on that, because I think that's an interesting commentary as well, which is kind of, I don't know what exactly he's trying to say there, but I think it's an interesting sort of territory to explore of like, is fudging the rules, quote unquote, a little bit to achieve what you know is the truth, okay to do, or maybe he's just pointing to certain kinds of hypocrisy. I don't know.
I think it sort of extends the Mona Lisa. Like, can the burning of the Mona Lisa be okay to achieve some greater good? In this case, the downfall of this glass onion billionaire. Can you do a little bit of harm to achieve something good? I have to admit that last moment went over my head a little bit. I thought, because they were all in the same room when she revealed the napkin, right? Like, they didn't see it up close and personal maybe, but I figured that they said that they didn't see the napkin because they were kind of playing to, they were still like under the wing of Miles. They were just saying, just as they were on the court, like they saw it, but they didn't really, they were just saying like, don't worry, Miles, we didn't see anything, even though we just stared at it and we saw exactly what happened. So yeah, I must say that moment didn't really land for me in that in that sense. Yeah.
I could be misreading it too. I might be reading too much into that specific line about lying for a lie and then lying for the truth.
I think it was maybe more that lie in the sense that now that I think of it, you might be right, but I think I assumed it in the sense like that they had to lie because there was no longer any physical evidence, so that
Right.
but then it wouldn't be a lie; they would just be telling the truth without
Yeah.
backup. But yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's an extension of what I just said. Like, how far would you be willing to go for your own principles? Would you do like, it might be the flip side of it. Like, what would you, what good thing would you sacrifice to disrupt the system, and what kind of harm would you be, or what kind of bad would you be do, or what lines would you cross personally to disrupt this? No, but that's not a disruption.
Yeah.
Maybe even like. It's very
yeah, that's how I feel too. I'm not sure exactly what he might be getting at with that, but I do think at the very least it's an interesting nod towards sort of a maneuver that I do see people do a lot, which is they'll say, "Ooh, I'm going to take this principled stand of I never lie" or something.
Yeah.
But they'll only apply that in the areas where it's already serving them. So they were fully willing to lie to uphold the system, but they're absolutely not willing to lie in order to tear down the system. So I think it works as kind of a critique of that sort of hypocrisy. Yeah. I don't know. I think drawing connecting yet another dot there to say like he's promoting sort of this ethos of like lying would be okay in order to, I don't know, I don't know if that's what he's getting at, but.
Yeah, I think one other thing, like there was another reading that I had of the Mona Lisa burning that maybe relates to that, which is that there's a difference between promoting something by showing it and by maybe, or instead of that, warning against something. Like you can see it as maybe, you can argue like the burning of the Mona Lisa, that's Johnson arguing like, oh, that's what has to happen for the system to be burned down or to be disrupted. Yeah. Or you can maybe say like, oh, we enact this sequence or this like chain of events in fiction so that we can go on a different path in reality, that we maybe don't let it go as far that we would need to burn or to sacrifice the Mona Lisa in order to disrupt the system. Like if we can see the glass onion for what it is, then it doesn't have to get to this point. And so in that sense, it might not be a call to action as much as it is a don't go here, be mindful, be sure you don't end up in this place kind of message, which is slightly different, but more, it would seem more like maybe empathetic on Johnson's end than just saying like, haha, Mona Lisa's burned.
Right, yeah.
And the billionaires dunked on it. Like that's
right.
I agree that's the kind of the more condescending view, or
Yeah. That feels like the shallower version of the movie, but I don't know. Whatever Johnson was thinking in his mind when he wrote this is not, I don't want to make it seem like that's what it's coming down to in terms of whether or not this was like a good, successful movie. I'm just interested in talking about that because I think it's fascinating to think about what the implications here are if you read this movie in a very literal way, and what he might be saying with it. Fun time. I think it's a fun movie and thought-provoking, even if you cringe when the Mona Lisa is burned.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a movie that challenges you to reflect on certain issues about the way we tend to put certain people on pedestals and have this, not just a relation with them that's based on worshipping, but also really evaluating on what our worshipping or our putting on the pedestal of these people actually means to society, like where the implications go and how this affects us, and if there really aren't any other different ways, and what would happen. Like, can we see the warning signs of the real life glass onions, so to say? And I think in the most favorable interpretation of that ending is that then that we do all that so that we don't have to end up burning the Mona Lisa, and we can just have it safely in the Louvre and safely in France and Paris, and don't have to have these billionaire types coming to even be able to rent the Mona Lisa for a weekend for their own vanity or whatever it is that they want to do with that painting. So yeah, I think that's my reading of Glass Onion. I liked it. Excited to see what's next. Like I'm hoping we get another Benoit Blanc adventure, because I do think I liked him very much as this more empathetic character, slightly more righteous, kind of engaged in the fight and not just the passive observer of the clues. So yeah, I'm hoping, I'm excited to see where his journey goes.
The real winner for me of the film is definitely Daniel Craig, and the extent to which he's just absolutely chewing it up in every moment of every scene in this film. He has amazing outfits in this movie. So yeah, I'd be happy to see more Daniel Craig, Benoit Blanc, and like I said at the beginning, I think this is a fun premise and series to just do contemporary mysteries. So here's to the next one. Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, you can listen to the next episode right now, already available on Nebula. Click the link in the description below to go to nebula.tv/cinema of meaning. And when you sign up that way, you'll get access to our episodes ad-free and a week early, and signing up using that link supports us as creators. If you listen through Nebula, you also get access to our monthly bonus episode in December. That was our discussion of Avatar 2, The Way of Water, which I think was a really fun discussion Tom and I had. You can check that out. You can also support the show by signing up for our Patreon. Click the link in the description below for more information about that. Thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.